Well, good morning. Welcome to Kern Airmanship Model in Detail. Today we're going to talk about team. I'm your presenter, Dave Cook, and this is session 7 of the 11 sessions in this series. And I notice we have some folks here this morning who have not attended one of these webinars, so just in case you don't know how to run your end of the webinar, let me give you a quick panel check out here. You should have this control panel up on the upper right hand side of your screen. The white arrow and the orange box will collapse or expand the control panel. If you want to send a text message, a question via text, just type it in this box and hit the send button. And preferred method, though, if you have a question or comment, is to raise your hand just by clicking on this raise your hand icon. This is a Wings program webinar, so you will get 1 knowledge credit for attending today. Webinar sponsor, in addition to the FAST team, is the Center for Airmanship Excellence, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Airmanship Excellence. I'd like to turn your attention here just to, for a minute, to the archives section of the Center for Airmanship Excellence website, and you can see that all of the sessions in the Kern Airmanship Model program, can't see them all here on this screenshot, but they're all there, links to requesting download. So if you've missed a session, you can go ahead and request it from the website, the archive section. If you have not yet completed the Redefining Airmanship series, I'd recommend you do that before you complete the Kern Airmanship Model in Detail series. The Redefining Airmanship series is a broader view at airmanship, and it'll get you better oriented towards all of the things we're talking about here. The Kern Airmanship Model in Detail series focuses on one of the 10 elements in the Kern Airmanship Model each week, so it's a lot more detail. And just to give you a quick overview to orient you on the whole series, in session 1 of the series we took an overview look at the Kern Airmanship Model. And then in session 2 we talked about flight discipline and then skill and proficiency in number 4. And those are the bedrock principles, the 3 bedrock principles of the Kern Airmanship Model. Then we looked at self in session 5, 6 was aircraft, and today, session 7, we're going to be talking about team. The next week we'll talk about environment and then risk, and those are the 5 pillars of knowledge in the Kern Airmanship Model. And then in session 10 we'll talk about situational awareness, and in 11, the final webinar in this series, we'll talk about judgment, and those are the capstone outcomes of the Kern Airmanship Model. And I want to remind those of you who have attended these webinars before, and for you new guys, this is the big question here that's kind of the end result of all of the study of airmanship. Is you should ask this question before you fly. If I don't fly right, should I fly at all? The webinar series is based on the book Redefining Airmanship. It was written by Colonel/Dr. Tony Kern, who has written 5 books on airmanship, generally considered to be the expert on airmanship. Highly recommend the book. It was published in 1997. Amazon still carries it. I think there's some other sources for it too. Let's review our shared definition of airmanship, and for you new guys, this will be a quick overview of what airmanship is all about here. And we approach it from the point of view of what is an expert airman. An expert airman possesses discipline, skill, and proficiency. An expert airman have a thorough understanding of themselves, their aircraft, their team, the environment they operate in, and the risks they face. And expert airmen consistently display exceptional situational awareness and use good judgment at all times. Keywords here: consistently and exceptional. Now, the Kern Airmanship Model, one way to look at it, and I think it's a real good way in terms of your personal airmanship development, is look at the Kern Airmanship Model as the scaffold upon which we build our airmanship skills and capabilities. You can use the Kern Airmanship model for a lot of different things, but I think this is the most important one. Consider it to be the scaffold upon which you're going to build your airmanship skills and capabilities. All right, let's quickly look at the whole Kern Airmanship model. We have the 3 bedrock principles: flight discipline, skill, and proficiency. Then upon those 3 bedrock principles rest the 5 pillars of knowledge: knowledge of self, knowledge of aircraft, team, knowledge of environment, and knowledge of risk. And upon those 5 pillars of knowledge rest the Capstone Outcomes, what we're going for here, which is situational awareness and judgment. Let me say that again in a little different way. If we consistently practice the bedrock principles of flight discipline, skill, and proficiency, while always striving for a more perfect knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk, then we can expect the capstone outcomes of ever-improving situational awareness and judgment. So let's focus now on this week's topic, knowledge of team. Ardant Dupic, I think I'm pronouncing that right, although I don't speak French, French Army officer and military theorist back in the 1800s, said, "Brave men who do not know each other will not dare to attack a lion. For less brave men, but knowing each other well, sure of their reliability, and consequently mutual aid, will attack resolutely." So a team of the same number of men, as long as they've had team training, they operate as a team, they can do a lot more than just 4 guys standing around. Kern has this to say about team. Good teams are made up of good individuals. Ironically, teamwork is an individual responsibility, much like the rest of airmanship. Now, Brigadier General Steve Ritchie was a Vietnam ace, and those of you who were around during the Vietnam War, I'm sure have heard of him before. He was very well known during the Vietnam War era. He flew F-4s. He said about teamwork, "I feel very fortunate to have received so much of the credit that really belongs to so many others. There were literally thousands of military and civilians involved in my success. Learning to operate within a team may well be the single most important thing we can do to contribute to success." So Ritchie had a clear view of what teams are, even though he was a fighter pilot. My apologies to any fighter pilots on the webinar today, but those guys are usually very individualistic. But Ritchie understood it was a whole team behind him that allowed him to do what he did. Let's look at the evolution of aviation teamwork. Good teams are made up of good individuals. Teamwork is an individual responsibility, so even though you're working within a team, it's your responsibility to be a good team member and to know how to work with the team. The concept of teamwork has evolved throughout the history of flight. It started with the simple relationship between an aviator and his mechanic. So that was the first team involved. But then very quickly, before 1927, when Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, the team had grown, the support team had grown considerably. And if you read any of the biographies or Lindbergh's autobiography, you'll see that that team that he had working with him to make that flight was extensive. It started with the backers in St. Louis that came up with the money, supported them, and it went out there to the factory where the airplane was built, the Ryan factory. And there were scores of people. I don't know how big it was at the time, but there were at least scores of people that built the airplane. And then he had a flight support team, even had a publicist. So a pretty extensive team by early on in the evolution of aviation. Teamwork has evolved into something far more complex, however, over these years. It is one of the most researched aspects of modern aviation, so that's good. We have a lot of empirical data to use to build team training programs and to structure our team operations. Teamwork now involves myriad relationships between a pilot and multiple sources of information, flight service guide, websites that we use, the flight school operator, if that's how you get to your flying. So multiple sources of information. And it involves various pieces of equipment. Now Kern, in his model, treats equipment, especially the new modern glass cockpit Autoflight type equipment, as part of the team. So obviously that's a bit of a stretch, but not too much in today's world where we're all really use automation and computers, for example, as part of our personal team. So as we go through this, you'll see that we'll be talking about the equipment as part of the team. And it involves a variety of people, not just the flight service guy. It'd be your mechanic, the person that gives you the keys to the airplane, your maintenance people, insurance guy, the guy who controls the hangar you rent. All of these things are part of your team. The skills associated with aviation team development are defined in CRM courses, Cockpit Resource Management. Now you'll also hear CRM defined as Crew Resource Management. So it's both really, but we're going to focus more on the cockpit resource management aspects today, because most of us, in personal flying are flying single pilot, although we will touch on two pilot operations a bit. So I have a question for you at this point, and let me get to that and ask you the question. First question. Right now, do you think of yourself as operating as a member of an aviation team, or do you think you're strictly a solo operation out there? How do you think about that right now? Okay, still waiting for everybody to vote. All right, I guess we still have some people on here who haven't voted. Okay, well, I guess whoever's not voting is not going to vote, so I will go ahead and close this and share the results with you. So of those who voted, 100% say yes, they think that they're operating within a team right now, which is good, because that's what you're doing. And I have a second question for you. Have you had any formal cockpit resource management training? Now, I don't mean your instructor or somebody you flew with just kind of talked about it a little bit. I'm talking about full-blown course in cockpit resource management, because that's what you need to really get to it. So, okay, so everybody voted who's going to vote. Close it and share it with you. So 100% no, and that's usually the case in our world of personal flying. So that's why we're going to focus on this, and then later on we'll have programs, cockpit resource management training programs, because that's what they need to be, formal training programs. Now let's talk a little bit about the value of teamwork. Teamwork seeks to improve performance in three primary ways. It adds to the pool of knowledge and expertise available to confront various situations. So you're looking at the weather. You've had a trip planned out to the vacation home for a couple of weeks now. Family's ready to go. You get up in the morning, call flight service, or do whatever you do to get your weather briefing, and there's a large area of thunderstorms between you and the airport near your vacation home. So now you are in a position of either making that go, no-go decision yourself, or if you operate within a team, you can start talking to more people on your team to get their opinions, and everybody adds knowledge to the knowledge base upon which you're going to make the decision, and they add ideas, perspectives for you. So that's how a team can help you. It allows for a synthesis of ideas and skills to make new options available to the group. If you have synthesis, that means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So you get more out of it if you put the parts together in a team. So you have more options available that way. And expert teams are capable of that synergy. Not every team is capable. Expert teams, and by expert teams, Kern means teams that have personally take responsibility for teamwork, personally learn teamwork skills, personally learn their role on the team, and then the team itself has a formal way of interacting, operating as a team, and they learn those techniques and processes and they practice them. And here's another good way to look at teams. Teamwork is an aviator's insurance policy. Sure, you can get out there and do everything by yourself and make all your decisions by yourself, but if you have other people backing you up, that's like an insurance policy. And I'll give you just one simple example. At the airlines and the military, all flights are dispatched by a qualified dispatcher. And at the airlines, it's FAA certificated dispatchers. The pilot cannot make the go, no-go decision by him or herself. So by having that other person in the loop, you have another set of ideas about whether or not the flight is safe. You got somebody helping you make that decision. That's like an insurance policy. Now, you have to do a little preparation, though, for teamwork training. Teamwork begins with personal competence and expertise. Mastery of your role on the team is the first step. So you have to be competent. So in our case here, we're talking about flying teams. You have to be a good pilot. You have to know what you're doing. You have to have expertise. Then after you have that, that's a prerequisite. Then you master your role on the team. For most of us, our role on the team is we're the pilot flying the airplane. But if it's two-pilot operation, then you could either be the captain or the co-pilot. And you have to master those roles. In fact, I flew for United for 22 years, and towards the end I got to thinking that, whatever role I was flying in that cockpit as, it was like learning a role in a play. There's lines you have to memorize and be able to recite at the right times. You have to know what the other person is going to do and say and how they're going to react. So it's really a role. You have to learn that role. Only then are you ready for the next step, and that's refining team skills. So first of all, you got to be good. You have to be competent. You have to have expertise. Then you have to master your individual role, and then, only then, are you ready to start putting it together as a team with other people. You must then understand and practice the techniques inherent in aviation team building. So there are techniques. There's a knowledge base. There's plenty of stuff to draw from here. But you either have to read about it a lot, or the best way is to attend training, cockpit resource management training. And again, we plan to have some of those types of training programs available here in the not-too-distant future. Here are some advantages of teams. The two most important advantages of teamwork are increased reliability and mutual support. And those do stand out as the biggest advantage. Your decisions are going to be more reliable, more consistently good, and that mutual support, again, that's your insurance policy. It makes you safer. These elements are critical to successful flight operations, and this is, I think, one of the big areas where we see the cause of the huge difference between the accident rates in general aviation and airline flying. General aviation accident rates are about 34 times higher than airline flying. One of the main reasons is when an airline flight launches, it's supported by a vast team that is competent, and they know their roles, and they've trained as a team, so they know how to do it. Some other team advantages. An aviator in an expert team environment can act with more confidence and initiative. That's very important for a pilot. Everybody benefits from good teamwork. There are no downsides to good teamwork. We'll see there's some downsides to not so good teamwork, but there's no downside to good teamwork. Here are some hazards that face all teams. Few fully understand the nature and intricacies of effective teamwork. You have to be trained. I have been through I don't know how many CRM type courses over my career, many, since we started using CRM in the aviation world in the early 80s. And and I've read a lot about it, and I've taught it a lot, and so I feel like I know it pretty well how to do it. But again, it takes a lot of learning to get to that point. Interpersonal relationships can adversely affect operations. That's obvious. If we don't have a good relationship, let's say with our fueler, we've given him a hard time, he's more likely to not share what he knows or sees with us. So that interpersonal relationship can really affect the safety of our operation. That's just one example. This can result in team performance that is actually poorer than individual performance. Again, we want to have the team around us for that insurance policy, but if we're not doing it right, it's probably going to make it less safe. And here's a good example I always like to talk about in this regard. If you normally fly your airplane by yourself, you're a single pilot operation, and then you get a buddy that's a pilot, and you decide you're going to go flying together. And if you don't know what you have to establish in terms of how your team is going to perform, that's actually more dangerous than if you were flying alone. Because if that other guy starts, tuning radios or pulling the gear up or putting it down, whatever, I mean, if he's not coordinated with you, the pilot, then you're actually have poorer performance. You're less safe. Teamwork development should be approached systematically. So like everything in the current airmanship model, everything we talk about with airmanship development, we always talk about doing it systematically. Have a clear plan, written plan, and do it step by step, work the plan. So that's important here with learning teamwork and then exercising teamwork. It has to be systematic. You do have some personal responsibilities with teamwork. And here's what good social skills are no substitute for deficiencies in individual knowledge or skill. And what Kern's talking about here is, and you probably have experienced this around the airport, some guys can talk a good flight. I mean, they sound like they're really good airmen, but they're not good team players. And those good social skills, because you like them and they seem like good guys, they're funny, you think that they're good pilots. They have good team skills, but they may not. So it can mask good team skills. Because of the inherent trust involved in a mutual support organization, each team member must be fully prepared to do his or her job. Be open and honest about any current lack of proficiency. So you get out to the airport, and let's say that it's a situation where you're going to take some friends flying, and that day you're just not up to speed, so your proficiency is lacking. Very tough to tell everybody you've rented the airplane from the rental operation, everything's all set to go. Very tough to tell them, hey, I just shouldn't be flying today, so therefore we aren't. But you've got to fess up as a teammate that that's the situation. So that's an example there. Still on personal responsibilities, this is a matter of personal integrity. We must have personal integrity if we're going to play on an aviation team. That's vital. It's critical. Probably the most important thing. We all have to be able to trust our fellow teammates. We have to be able to trust what they say, know that it's true. If not done, an extremely dangerous condition can be created. So if anybody hedges on that truth, that integrity, it can get very dangerous very quickly. When others count on you in the inherently dangerous environment of flight, you have a moral obligation to respond with competence. So we're not talking regulatory obligation. We're not talking about practical obligation. We're talking about moral obligation. And I think this is real important to think about. I think we've kind of lost this in aviation because we all share that airspace up there. And in a lot of cases, we share airplanes that we fly. And, for example here, if you take an airplane out and fly it and something's wrong with the airplane, but you think you might have caused it, and you think, well, a lot of people fly this airplane, I'm just not going to say anything because I might have to pay for it. Well, the next guy comes out, he doesn't notice it, he can actually end up crashing. So, you've got to have that integrity if you're going to play on an aviation team. An unskilled or undisciplined aviator adds very little to the team effort. So you can't just say you're part of a team. You've got to actually be part of a team and qualify. You've got to be skilled and you've got to be disciplined. Matters can be made much worse by an incompetent team member who masquerades as a competent one. And I've run into this in 2 pilot operations over the years, not only as a pilot in a cockpit with another guy, but also I instructed for about 4 years in the Flight Safety Challenger program. I was also a check airman. So I saw a lot of very experienced corporate crews, very experienced jet crews, and guys that flew together a lot. And I could see that one guy was carrying the other sometimes and covering up that incompetent or maybe just incompetent particular areas, skills, or whatever. So the outcome, the proficiency of that crew as a crew is degraded because one of them is hiding some incompetency. This type of individual is a parasitic liability to the safety and effectiveness of the whole group. Now, when I read this in Redefining Airmanship, I thought, boy, Colonel Kern, that sounds like a colonel. That's pretty drastic. And can we really look at personal flying this way? Because it's a whole nother ball of wax from professional flying. But I have come to believe that we have got to think this way. If there is somebody who's not playing as a good team member, shirks their responsibility, they really are a parasitic liability. They're going to end up, those are the kind of people that are highly likely to end up in an accident. And of course that affects all of us. It affects our insurance rates. If we're in a flying club, that can affect our economic situation if somebody crashes the airplane. All kinds of things come out of the potential of somebody being a parasitic liability on the team rather than a positive team member. Team management and crew communications are another area that we need to look at. Good teams establish an environment for open communications. Now, do you think that this cockpit here is got a good environment for open communications? I can tell you from experience that I've been in those kind of cockpits, especially when I was a young airline pilot, and some of the captains were still World War II guys, hadn't retired yet, and a lot of Korean War guys. And of course they had a different attitude. I flew for United for over 10 years, probably about 12 years, I think, before we started doing cockpit resource management training. And so it was really, the cockpit was whatever the captain decided it was going to be. And there were a lot of guys just like this, I don't want to hear anything except clear right, I'll take the chicken, which is an airline joke because the co-pilot's always supposed to look out the right window if the captain's getting ready to turn the airplane right, especially on the ground, and say clear right. And the I'll take the chicken part of the joke is a good co-pilot, when the stewardess comes up, now they're called flight attendants, comes up and offers the crew meals. There's usually 2 choices, sometimes 3, steak, chicken, and sometimes fish. Well, the captain wants the steak, so a good co-pilot is supposed to say, I'll take the chicken. So therefore, the standard joke in the airline world is, clear right, I'll take the chicken. But this is not a good environment, obviously. It has to be open communications all the time. And some elements, some aspects of open communications are when the other guy's talking, the other teammate's talking, you got to listen with patience. You can't interrupt. You got to let them tell you everything they're going to tell you. And when we're in a hurry, you want to get off the ground, weather's moving in. A lot of times you have to really consciously say, wait a minute, I'm going to slow down. Wish this guy would talk faster, but I got to listen to what he's got to say, and I'm not going to interrupt him. Another aspect of good communications, you have to make appropriate eye contact. Now, if you're giving the other guy the evil eye while he's telling you something, that's a body language, part of body language, and he's going to pick that up. There's no doubt about it, and then he's going to start reacting to that physical attitude that you're showing, and maybe it's going to impede communications, and he's not going to tell you what he needs to tell you. So appropriate eye contact, though, shows you're interested and that you're paying attention. You have to practice appropriate nonverbal communication. The communication theorists will tell you that about 80% of all of our communication is nonverbal, body language, so forth. Well, you've got to understand what the proper signals are, and so you learn them, and then you have to use them in the nonverbal communication side of crew communications. Also, good teams conduct thorough, systematic, and interesting briefings. So even if you're a team of one, you should have a systematic way. Like I think I've mentioned before in some of these webinars, I've gotten to the point, even with my, somewhere around 20,000 hours, 50 some years of flying, I have gotten to the point now, and I will admit a little bit of its memory. I have to jack up my memory a bit now as I get older, but I do use a regular checklist for all of my pre-flight activities, so I don't miss anything. So the briefing, that's like briefing yourself when you do that. If you're flying with other people or you're going to brief your team, then you have to have a format for the briefing and then walk through that format systematically, but you want to keep it interesting. And the content must be relevant, but not dogmatic. In other words, you don't want to get it to where it's rote, you're just reading off something or spouting off something, and it's got to be relevant to the flight. Expectations are set for how to handle deviations in that briefing. And again, even if you're briefing yourself, you've got to brief on that. Okay, on this flight, here's our plan. You brief the plan. And then you say, here's how we're going to handle any deviations from the plan. And there's going to be deviations for the plan. There's never been a flight that I can think of where the flight was executed 100% according to the plan. So there's going to be deviations. How are you going to handle them? What are you going to do? And if you're flying with other people, who's going to do what? Or if you're working with a dispatcher, what's the dispatcher going to do if you have to deviate? What are you going to do? So these have to be briefed. And then there also should be appropriate social conversation and humor in that briefing, because you got to keep humor and a little bit of social bantering appropriately. That's kind of the grease that keeps that communications going freely. So you should have some of that. And that's not totally critical, but it's a good idea to get in that habit. Other communications traits of successful teams include: all team members ask probing questions. So you can't have somebody on the team, that is not going to be a question asker. They've got to be trained. Everybody on the team's got to be trained to ask questions if they feel something isn't right, they see something that they don't understand, and the questions have to probe what they see or what they think or what they feel. So it has to be a probing question. What do you, Captain, has that fuel gauge been down there on a 1/4 tank for, how long has it been there? Probing question. Now, there's an art to this when you're flying with two pilots, because you don't want to make the other person feel dumb. You don't want to challenge their competence, because you've got to keep that communication flowing. So there's techniques to learn here on how you do this. Also, all team members must voice their concerns. I don't know if you've listened or read the transcript of the Miracle on the Hudson flight with Sullenberger and Skiles there, but they were voicing their concerns. They had excellent cockpit communications going on after they lost those two engines. Also, all team members have to be assertive. You can't be a shy person if you're going to operate on an aviation team. You have to feel confident enough in what you know to be able to ask those probing questions, to make suggestions. You have to be assertive. Also, events, changes, and decisions must be verbalized. And I recommend, if you're flying by yourself, verbalize them to yourself, because that reinforces whatever it is you're thinking if you're by yourself. But definitely if there's more than one pilot in the cockpit, you've got to verbalize every change. And in fact, my cockpit technique is I verbalize with the co-pilot. I will verbalize even if I'm making a turn, if I'm changing altitude, whatever I'm doing, so that we're all on the same page and that other pilot has an opportunity to question what I'm doing or make a suggestion or whatever. Let's talk a little bit about Autoflight Management, because as you guys know that have attended these webinars, I think this is where it's going. We're all going to be more and more into autoflight as our old 30-plus year average age fleet starts retiring. And will be obviously they're going to be replaced primarily with glass cockpit airplanes with autopilot. So that's autoflight. So I have a question for you first, though, before we get into all that. So let me call that up. And I'd like to know before we go through this, do you have any experience with glass cockpit autoflight? Now, by glass cockpit autoflight, I mean glass cockpit, more than one screen. You've got a moving map, you've got your EFIS, electronic flight instrument system, you've got GPS, and you've got autopilot, and you fly it by using that system. That's what I'm talking about, autoflight. So, okay, everybody's voted who's going to vote. I will close that, and I'll share it. So, of those who voted, not everybody did say that they have had some experience with glass cockpit autoflight. That's good. Most times I ask this question, nobody has had that kind of experience. And I have another question for you here. So, of those of you who have experience with glass cockpit autoflight, would you say that you're proficient now in glass cockpit autoflight? Okay, looks like. Okay, everybody's voted. So half of you say yes, and half of you say no, that you're not proficient with glass cockpit autoflight. Okay, let's move on. Autoflight is designed to reduce workload and improve performance. And in fact, if you are proficient in the use of autoflight systems, they drastically reduce your workload if you are proficient. We all know that we've been through it as we're learning systems, even if you're first learned and you're using a Garmin 430 or 530, for example, you know that before you got proficient using it, you could get yourself into situations where you just increased your workload dramatically. So, but if they're used properly, if you know how to use them, use autoflight, you're proficient, it can drastically reduce that workload, thereby improving your performance. Unfortunately, it often leads to new challenges and levels of complacency. And I'm going to talk about this for a minute from personal experience. I believe that glass cockpit autoflight is here to stay. But it hasn't been around that long, and not that many of us have a whole lot of time flying glass cockpits. Those of us that have been flying in the professional world for the last 20 years, 30 years, I think, I checked out on my first glass cockpit in the early 80s. We have a lot of experience. But we don't know where all the traps are yet. And with the old VOR navigation system and ILS approaches, they'd been around so long that we all knew where the traps were using those systems. And instructors could teach the traps, and we could learn the traps and avoid the traps. There are still a lot of traps in glass cockpit flying, autoflight, that we don't even know about yet. So we've got to discover those traps, we've got to document them, and then we've got to teach them, and then we have to learn them. So, and also you can get very complacent if you are using autoflight itself all the time. I learned when I checked, the first glass cockpit I checked out on was a Boeing 737-300 for United Airlines. And I had been strictly a steam gauge guy up to that point because that's all we had, even in the airliners. And so I loved that automation stuff. In fact, at the time that I checked out in the 300, I was learning to fly the space shuttle, and it had quite a bit of automation in it. So I was into that too. But I found out very quickly after starting to fly the line in the 737-300 that I was losing my skills rapidly, my proficiency at stick and rudder stuff, at flying without the automation, scanning, even though it's still easier to scan with the EFIS than it is the six-pack. You still had, those weren't as good as we have now, and you still had to do some scanning. So I started losing all that if I just stayed with the autoflight. So I set a personal policy. I tried to fly 3 different kinds of legs. We call them legs from A to B. 3 different kind of legs, and it would depend on the weather and the situation, and was it the co-pilot's turn to fly, and all that kind of stuff. But I tried to keep it as even as I can, a third, and a third. And I'd fly 1/3 of the legs in full auto flight. Our policy was at United, rotate on takeoff, at 400 feet AGL, autopilot on, auto flight down to the time that you're going to take the autopilot autopilot off for final landing. So, on final, short final, whatever it might be, ILS 200 feet, 100 feet if it's Cat 2, non-precision approach when we see the runway at MDA, that kind of thing. But it was autoflight the whole time. So I'd fly one leg that way, or a third of the legs, and I'd try to fly a third of the legs with the autoflight system giving me all the information. So I'd be using autoflight, except I wouldn't have the autopilot engaged. I would hand fly it, following the autoflight. And as if you've flown this stuff, you guys who have flown it know that you have a flight director. That's those little pink fly bars there. That's the yellow is the airplane symbol. And you just fly tight formation on those command bars, and that you're like the autopilot actuator then. You're just doing what the autoflight's telling you to do. Now, obviously, you're trusting but verifying the whole time. But I'd fly 1/3 of the legs, hand fly, but with following the autoflight. And then I would fly 1/3 of the legs with the autoflight off completely. I would turn the moving map off. I would turn off the flight director, no autopilot, and I would fly the old-fashioned way. And so again, I wasn't scanning six-pack, but I kept what scan was required for that glass cockpit up to speed. So I think that, and it worked fine for me for years. I never felt that I was losing proficiency in any one of those three skill areas, or any skills in those three areas, I should say. So there are ways to do it, but we have to be aware that there are new challenges in this autoflight, and we can get very complacent if we rely on it exclusively. There is a large number of autoflight-related accidents and incidents, especially in personal flying at our end of the game, and I have seen it. I instruct part-time out at Glass Simulator Center. We have a G1000 simulator out there. We have a Cirrus with an Avidyne. So I've seen a lot of guys trying to learn glass, and then the NTSB just did a big study here. I don't know, 6 months ago. The report came out about 6 months ago, and they said that the new glass cockpits, the new technically advanced aircraft, have not significantly reduced the accident record. But they said, we know why. And it's what I'm saying. I know why. It's because people aren't getting good initial training, and then they aren't getting good recurrent training on the systems, and then they aren't practicing their non-autoflight skills. So you have to do all those things to make the autoflight systems, glass cockpits, safer than the old six-pack. But if you do those things, all of us that I know, professional pilots that I know, and personal flyers will agree that it makes it much, much safer. So we have to manage autoflight in various ways, and I mentioned one way you manage it to keep your skills up in the other areas, but effective teams are very careful about their autoflight procedures. Very careful. We'll talk a bit about that. They establish specific autoflight guidelines that include when the autoflight will be used, when autoflight will not be used, and autoflight callouts, and cross-check and monitoring protocols. So let's talk about this a second. I mean, it gets real formal. For example, the way that we were doing it at United at the time I was flying at 300 is, let's say I'm the captain and I'm flying the airplane. If I wanted to change altitude, I would say to the co-pilot, altitude select, whatever the altitude was, 5,000. And then he would set 5,000 in the altitude pre-select and say we were at 10,000. Set it at 5,000, and he'd say altitude set 5,000. I'd say vertical speed 1,000. He'd reach over and hit the vertical speed button and then turn the little knob to give us 1,000 feet down. So that's one way, a formal way of doing it. We also had in our operations specifications, our flight op manual, we also had clear times when we would and would not use autoflight. For example, if the weather was down to 200.5, it was a Cat 1 ILS, autoflight's required. You can't hand fly it down there. On a nice day, go ahead and fly it down there to 100, 100 and look up at 100 feet. Of course, in a jet, if you don't need a hood, you just look down, kind of scrunch down a little bit, and you can't see out. So, or can't see the runway in this case on our approach. So you could practice flying down to 100 feet on an ILS hand flying. But if it was the real thing, the rule was you had to use Autoflight. So you got to have these rules laid out in the flight operations manual for the team, and you have to have those call-outs, and you have to have cross-checking all the time. I'm sure you've heard about incidents where call-outs were not made, cross-checking was not done, and the pilots got into trouble. So you must do that. It has to be formalized, and you have to both pilots have to know what they are. And if you're flying by yourself, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing call-outs. You should. Effective teams know that Autoflight is not infallible. I see this a lot out there in a simulator at Glass. Now, I'm working with primarily guys who own their own high-performance singles and twins. Generally, they have instrument ratings and fairly good amount of experience. Been flying for a long time, most of them, and they use the Autoflight, and then something goes wrong with the Autoflight. I put a failure in, or more likely, they screw it up. They don't do something. They get lost in the pages, whatever. And then they're in trouble because they've been relying on that Autoflight. Well, again, it's not infallible, so my personal policy whenever I fly an Autoflight system is I always have the old-fashioned backups tuned into something that's going to help me if I can find it. So in other words, if I'm flying GPS direct, wherever the VORs around me, I'll have them tuned in on number 1 and number 2. I'll have my RMI set so the needles are pointing at both of those VORs. I'll have, if it's a missed approach, I'll have the VOR tuned in for the missed approach fix, have the radial set on the CDI, all those kinds of things to be prepared for that failure, because you have to know that either it's going to fail or you're going to screw up. Now, mean time between failures on this new Glass stuff is real high compared to the old steam gauge stuff, but still they fail. It has something to do with those electrons, right? They never rely completely on Autoflight for flight safety. You can't do that. If you've gotten to the point with your system, even if it's, again, a 430, 530 system, that you don't think you could find your way from A to B without it, boy, you better do some thinking, get some more training, change your ways. When Autoflight overload occurs, and it will, effective teams downmode Autoflight. So you have to know when you're getting behind the game with the Autoflight and you've got your head down too much, so forth. And we'll talk a little bit about warning flags later. Then it's you have to know how to download out of that full Autoflight to a mode that you can handle, that the workload is within your capabilities. Okay, I've got another question for you here. Would you like to learn and be proficient in Glass Cockpit Autoflight? Okay, I'm going to close that and share it with you. So, great, 100% of you say yes, you would like to learn it, and I know that some of you from that previous answer already are using it, and I would imagine that you said yes because you want to stay proficient in it. Okay, here's some other attributes of effective teams. There's feedback. There's trained formal feedback loops for everybody so that you're getting it. But an important part of this teamwork is that rather than emphasizing the negative, you emphasize the positive. So there's got to be a lot of that. We used to call them attaboys at United. Every time you did something right, you got an attaboy. But of course, it was the formula was it took 10 attaboys to make up for one dummy. Of course, that wasn't exactly what we called it, but one dummy. So you got to have feedback in the teamwork. You have to have a way to manage conflict, because if we're human beings, there's going to be some kind of conflict depending on our personality. So, and again, this isn't just in two pilot cockpits. You could have a conflict with, your flight school manager. If that's where you're flying an airplane, you have a conflict with your mechanic. But so we're going to have conflict periodically. So we have to have a way to manage that conflict. And we have to have proactive innovation proactive intervention when poor airmanship is revealed. We can't stick our heads in the sand when we see poor airmanship around us. We're all in the same sky. If we're in a shared airplane environment, we're flying the same airplanes. So when we see something that is an indicator of poor airmanship, we've got to do something about it. But good teams have a formal process for that, what that something is. So you're not hanging out there thinking, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? There's a way to do it that everybody's agreed to play by that rule. All right, the key to successful teams is communications. Communications is the glue that holds the team together. Effective teamwork relies on the quality as well as the quantity of communication. So it isn't just a bunch of talking or a bunch of newsletters. It's got to be high quality too. And good teamwork is authority with participation. A team somebody has to have authority on the team, chief pilot, chief safety officer, whatever, but they're not autocratic. Everybody's participating in that authority. And you have to have, as we mentioned earlier, assertiveness, but that assertiveness has to be done with respect. It can't be, hey, Captain, what a dummy you are. You're flying 20 knots slower than the program speed. Shove those throttles up. Get going. Well, that's no respect. And if you do it that way, you know what the reaction is going to be from the captain. He's going to either get mad at you and start berating you and telling you to, you're not, your teamwork is, skills are lacking. So you don't even want to get in that mode. When you learn teamwork, when you learn aviation teamwork, you'll learn that this is a huge aspect of that teamwork. You have to be assertive, but you always have to be respectful. Let's talk specifically now a little bit about that cockpit resource management training. CRM training produces pilots who consistently use sound judgment, make quality decisions, and access all required resources under stressful conditions and in time-constrained environment. So it's not just accessing resources. We got the extra burden here in the flight environment is it's going to be stressful, and we don't have a whole lot of time to solve problems. So that's what CRM training produces, these kind of pilots. Here's a brief history of CRM training. Not too long after World War II, in 1951, the U.S. Air Force Inspector General did a study on accidents and issued a report that said essentially that the military, the Air Force, should start doing, they didn't call it that back then, but should start doing cockpit resource management training. But nothing happened until 1978 when United Airlines Stretch DC-8 went out in Portland. And I'll tell you the story quickly in case you don't know it. Flight took off from Denver, went up to Portland, short hop. That airplane could fly a long way, so that was not a problem. They had adequate fuel on board. In fact, the captain that was flying the flight was a kind of guy that always liked to carry extra fuel, so they had a little extra fuel on board. But he was also an Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, investigator, accident investigator. So he had seen a lot of accidents, and he had this personal philosophy in that if he ever had to put an airplane on the ground without the landing gear being down and the runway being under it, he was going to do it with minimum fuel on the airplane, because as we all know, the post-crash fire is the biggest killer of aviation accidents. A lot of them are survivable, except a lot of people die in the fires. So that's pretty good thinking. So I'm going to land with minimum fuel. However, this night it didn't work out so good. They got up there to Portland and they put the gear down normal procedures while they were just coming up on the marker, the outer marker on the ILS approach. And they got 2 green, but they didn't get the 3rd green. So did the right thing, missed the approach, went out and got in a holding pattern and started working the problem. And they even did a pretty good job of that, because the captain told the co-pilot, fly the airplane, keep it in the holding pattern, and then the captain started working the problem with the flight engineer. They even got San Francisco maintenance, or United's big maintenance base, on board or on the line on the radio, and they had maintenance supports. They were working the team thing real good, but they couldn't get the gear down, the 1 gear down. So the captain decided, okay, we're going to have to land with one gear up, so I'm going to go down to minimum fuel. Again, not necessarily a bad idea, except these old DC-8s had notoriously unreliable fuel gauges, especially down towards the lower end of things. And the captain decided he was going to rely on the fuel gauges for getting to minimum fuel. So they got down to, started burning down there, and after a little bit, the co-pilot started expressing some concerns, and the engineers started expressing concerns about the fuel state. But again, this was before CRM training, so the captain was the captain. And he said, no, we're going to burn that fuel down. And the other two guys weren't assertive enough to stop him from doing that. So they got it down to where he thought the captain thought it was the right fuel level. They started the approach. They ran out of fuel. I think it was 4 miles from the airport and crashed. Now, they didn't do much burning, and a lot of people got out, so he was right about that. But if he had discussed with the crew, if the other guys had been more assertive, hey, captain, these fuel gauges aren't very reliable down here at the low quantities. We better hedge our bets here a bit. If he had thought that, a lot of things ifs there, then that accident wouldn't have happened. But the investigators, the ALPA, the airline, the NTSB, all cited this crew teamwork as being the critical factor in the accident. And that's when United Airlines decided to introduce, we called it crew resource management, but cockpit resource management into the pilot group. And I happened to be in a position at United at the time that I got involved with that, the introduction of it, went through some of the very first training we had on it, and then have been involved with CRM training ever since. I really believe in it. I think it's something we have to do. But that's how that was the first instance of CRM training at United Airlines. Actually, it took them till the early 80s to get the program together and start doing it. That was the first CRM training. Then by the mid-80s, the military finally started catching up, and they've been doing it. They've been using CRM training ever since the 80s. And now it's used by all the airlines, by the military, and at the present time by good charter and corporate operators. The FAA is mandating CRM training for all Part 135 operators. It already is mandated for 121 operators. But good corporate operators use it too. So at this point we can say the good charter and corporate guys are using it. The rest of them aren't. And of course we're not using it in personal flying to any great extent. This is one of the things that we're out to change here with the Center for Airmanship Excellence, is to provide this training for guys. Here are some elements of CRM training. And no, this isn't good CRM here. Co-pilot checklist. Don't touch anything. Keep your mouth shut. That was, again, back before CRM training. That's how a lot of cockpits were run. All right. Part of CRM training is situational awareness training. There are techniques and procedures to have good situational awareness. You learn that. Group dynamics, of course, is a very important part in teamwork. Effective communications we've talked about. Risk management. And there are formal ways to identify risk, assess risk, and then manage the risk. Same thing with decision making. Workload management. Stress awareness management. Flight planning, briefing, and critique strategies, and physiology and human performance. So that's kind of an outline for a CRM course that you're looking at there. When you take a CRM course, you're going to be going through all those things. Now, general aviation CRM, we believe the CRM principles used by professional aviators are extremely useful for GA pilots. Even if you're flying alone in a single pilot cockpit, they're extremely useful. I've got a question for you. Would you like to learn to be proficient in cockpit resource management? Yes or no? Okay. Guess everybody who's going to vote has voted. So of those who have voted, not everybody has, they say 100% yes, I would like to be proficient in CRM. All right, let's look at this week's case study. Now we're going to go a little over this hour. If you have to jump off, you've earned your credit. You have to attend for an hour to earn the Wings program credit, and if you'll be able to download video recording of this webinar in a day or two. So if you have to jump off, that's fine. We're probably going to go another 15 minutes here, would be my estimate. So our case study this week comes right out of the book, Redefining Airmanship. This flight was on an IFR flight plan, but they were in VMC conditions. There was a pilot and one passenger on board. It was the guy's wife, and she was in the right seat. They were in cruise climb approaching 6,000 feet with an ATC clearance to 10,000 feet. They were out over the ocean about 10 minutes after takeoff. They were passing through 6,000 feet, and the pilot noticed the vacuum gauge needle was flickering. We're going to talk about this later as a clue, a red flag. The engine made a grinding noise, and the propeller came to an abrupt stop. Boy, that'd be a shock, wouldn't it? Out over that water especially. The pilot, though, immediately decreased airspeed to 85 knots, which was best glide speed, and turned towards the departure airport. Most important thing when you lose an engine in a single-engine airplane is doing these two things. Get on best glide speed and turn towards an airport before you start doing anything else. He did that. Very good. He closed the cowl flaps. This particular airplane had cowl flaps to reduce the drag. And that, I'm sure, was in the emergency procedure for engine failure. He knew that, closed the cowl flaps. He alerted departure control of the engine failure and the course deviation, so he let the rest of his team know what was going on there. He gave his wife the emergency checklist, and she read it to him. So he already had a plan what he was going to do, and he used all available resources rather than him pulling out that checklist and trying to read it while he's trying to keep that baby nailed on 85 knots and pointed right towards the airport. He had his wife read it. She read it out loud to him. He placed the mixture and fuel selector to off. That was part of the checklist, so he followed the checklist. And he maintained that best glide speed and kept her going to the airport. He also had the presence of mind to reduce the electrical load. He was managing his resources because he knew that he was down to battery power, and who knows how long a battery is going to last, and he wanted to be able to continue to talk to ATC. Luckily, that's all he needed electricity for was the comm, but he was smart enough to know that and that he should reduce the electrical load, so he did that. He focused on maintaining airspeed and keeping the airport in sight. Those are his words. He briefed his wife on ditching preparations. He thought he might end up in the water, so he knew that he needed to do that. I hope he had her crack the door open. That's important in ditching. So they were ready to ditch. Turned out he had plenty of altitude upon arrival at the airport. I think that's because he immediately turned towards the airport and got on his best glide speed. But he ended up over the airport, so the threat of going in the water was gone. So he flew an abbreviated downwind and base leg. Very good plan. Fly as closely to your normal procedures as you can if you're doing a dead stick landing. It's easier to judge, how much more altitude you need to make it to the runway and all that kind of stuff. He lowered the gear on short final and the flaps on short final. Now, I would totally disagree with this. I have seen it over and over in a sim, is that guy comes in with engine out, dead stick approach, and he's a little bit high on final, a couple miles out, and says, "Oh, okay, I got to get that gear down. Now's the right time." Puts the gear down, and ends up short of the runway. My personal approach to this is, if I'm doing a dead stick landing in a retractable gear airplane, is I'm planning on belly landing on the runway. That's my plan. If I end up just coming up over that threshold, and I know that I'm going to make the runway for sure, at that point I'll put the gear down, not before I get to the runway, because you're a test pilot at that point. You don't know how that airplane is going to react when you put that gear down. I'm going to tell you, you're going to get a heck of a sinker if you put that gear down. Flaps, why in the world you'd want to put flaps down in a light airplane when you don't need them? I don't understand, but he did that. So other than that, I think he did a great job, but these two things I would not have done. So they made a safe landing. It was 12 minutes from engine failure to landing, so it probably seemed like an eternity to him. So here are some lessons learned from this case study. The pilot was prepared for the emergency. He obviously had thought through what he was going to do if he had an emergency. His use of all available resources, he did that, and that really is cockpit resource management. He had made his decisions in a timely manner. That's cockpit resource management. CRM principles can also identify potential problems before they occur. So I'm coming back to that flickering suction gauge. That is known as a red flag in CRM parlance. When he saw that red flag, that should have been a cue. That should have set up that he needs to start looking for something that might be going wrong with the vacuum system or the engine. Because if he knows his systems, he knows the vacuum system's driven by that engine-driven pump. So clues, red flags, that's part of the CRM. So he wasn't real good at that one. So let's talk about those red flags and error chains. We usually talk about these two concepts together. They're part of CRM. And when you go through CRM training, you'll spend a lot of time on red flags and error chains. Start with red flags. Red flags are warning signs, or I like to think of them like a red warning light going off in my face. The first step is to identify a red flag in an error chain. Again, we can come back to that fluctuating suction gauge. Got to identify it, and you say, that's a link. That's a possible link in an error chain that could jump up and bite me. So I've got to pay attention to that red flag. Then there are 11 cues to help identifying these red flags. We're going to talk about them in a minute. So this isn't something that is very subjective. We know exactly what kinds of things we need to be looking for. There's 11 clues to identify red flags. Now let's talk a little bit about error chains. There is seldom one overpowering cause of an accident. We've found this out over the years. Unless you just have a mid-error, it just happened. But most accidents are a chain of events, a chain of red flags that if you can identify one of them, you can get out of it. So there are a number of these contributing factors, and that's why we call them an error chain. So the steps are identify a red flag in an error chain, then take corrective action. And by doing that, you're breaking that link in the error chain. And the incident or accident is probably going to be prevented. So it's very simple, very straightforward, but it's a process, a procedure. Here's those 11 clues that we can use to identify red flags. Ambiguity. I don't think that's quite right. Something is not right with this picture. You're looking at the panel, and two instruments, two of the six-pack are showing you're in a right climbing turn, and one of them's showing you're in a left diving turn. So ambiguity. Fixation or preoccupation. If you catch yourself, you've been looking at that attitude indicator now for 30 seconds, and you should have been scanning. That's a red flag. Something's wrong with you probably in this case. An empty feeling or confusion. I know this is touchy-feely stuff, but this has actually been brought out in many accident studies, is that the pilot or pilots, before the red flag came up, had just empty feeling. Something's wrong. I just don't know what it is. I can't quite put my finger on it. That's a red flag. When you get that feeling or you get confused, red flag. Something's going on. If you're getting ready to violate minimums, I can ease down below the minimum descent altitude on this non-precision approach, 50 feet. I'll see the runway. I'll see the ground. Well, that's a red flag because that link has led to many accidents. If you're going to do an undocumented procedure, that's a red flag. No one flying the airplane, that's a red flag. No one looking out the window. Failure to meet targets. Unresolved discrepancies. Departure from standard operating procedures, and poor communications. All red flags. And again, when you go through CRM training, spend a lot of time looking at each one of these clues so that you recognize them readily. Another big part of crew cockpit resource management is workload management. And, it's a way to prioritize tasks. It's a way to look at workload management. We've all looked at this graphic. Workload, goes up. It's highest on approach and landing. You've got your level of airmanship, your capabilities, and as that workload approaches your capabilities, that's your safety margin in between. If the workload punches through your capabilities, red flag, something's wrong. So by knowing how to prioritize tasks, you can manage your workload, keep it down underneath your capability line. Also, workload management prevents a loss of situational awareness. Very important part of maintaining situational awareness is managing the workload. And it prevents distractions. Cockpit distractions are one of the big red flags, or one of the big things that's links and error chains that get us. So we've got to have a way to manage those distractions. And it can defeat the hurry-up syndrome. Workload management can defeat the hurry-up syndrome because generally you get into hurry-up when you get behind the timeline. Your workload management is not doing what it's supposed to do. And I can think back of all the times that I've gotten in a hurry, especially to get the flight going and get off the ground. I can think of a lot of times when I did that I screwed up. There was a red flag that came up in that error chain that was developing. So hurry up is a real dangerous mode to get into. Here's what Kern has to say on teamwork here as a little bit of a closing thought on it. Teamwork does not remove final authority or responsibility for safe operations from the PIC. So just because you have a good team, you got formal teamwork procedures, you're still the PIC. Good teamwork begins with effective leadership. So you as the pilot are generally considered to be the leader. You've got to know how to be a leader. You've got to practice good leadership skills. But if you're operating within a flight organization, the leadership within the organization has to be good at teamwork and consider it a critical part of the safety culture. Good teams establish norms of safety, compliance, communication, and cooperation. So you do have a flight ops manual that spells all these things out. A good team establishes an environment conducive to good team operations. We talked about that. And this is not just a one-time thing. You've got to maintain that environment that's conducive to good team operations. And this kind of environment fosters assertiveness, honesty, and trust, which we know we have to have on a team. So I would suggest once more that you read the book, Redefining Airmanship, because there are several more case studies in this chapter on teamwork that are excellent and really illustrate what we've been talking about here. But again, it took a little bit too much time to go through them in the format of this webinar. And also, even though we're drilling down deeper in this series on the airmanship model, each one of the elements, even with an hour and a half of time on a webinar, we can't get all of the information that's in the book into the webinar. So I would highly recommend you read the book. So here are the takeaways from this webinar. Good teams are made up of good individuals. Teamwork is an individual responsibility. Teamwork improves performance. Workload management is critical for situational awareness. And red flags and error chains, so remember those. So I have one more question for you. Would you like to operate as part of an aviation team? Yes, no, not sure yet. Okay, close it, share, and 100% of you say yes. Well, that's good. I'm glad to see that you have seen the light. So, are there any questions or comments? Best way to do it is to raise your hand with the raise your hand icon if you do have a question or comment. I'll give you a second here to think about it. Okay, looks like there are no comments or questions at this time. I remind you to register for Session 8, and we're going to talk about the Pillar of Knowledge environment. And because of the way this system is set up, you've got to go into the GoToWebinar site and register for each session you want to attend. You can't just register for one and then be registered for all of them. And you'll get that email. You already have the email from the FAA SPAN system. They send them out 14 days before the event, so we're only 7 days from Session 8, so you should have that email there someplace. If not, send me an email and I'll happy to send you the link. And if you have any comments or questions, come up with anything, you want to talk about airmanship, I'm available by a telephone. There's my number. There's my email address. Happy to handle your email. You can go to the airmanshipexcellence.org, which is the website for Center for Airmanship Excellence. Find a lot of resources there to support your quest for airmanship excellence. And I'd encourage you to go over to my blog, Captain Dave's Hangar, where we're talking about airmanship. Well, I'm going to leave you with what Chuck Yeager has to say about flying right. If you're going to fly, do it right. Thanks for attending. See you next week.